As I restlessly fought my way through waves upon waves of enemies while trotting through the same repetitive paths, a sense of tediousness crept in. I didn't feel like Spyro the Dragon going on an epic quest to stop the evils of the Dark Master. Instead, I merely mowed through more and more baboons, wondering how long I had to do this before moving on to the next part of the level. But first, let's go back to the beginning. So Spyro began shortly after Insomniac had finished their first game, Disruptor. While Disruptor failed financially, the critical success caught the attention of Universal, and they contracted Insomniac to make a mascot for the PlayStation since its reputation was dwindling compared to the N64. Craig Stitt came up with the idea to make the game about a dragon, and after smoothing out some of the rough edges like figuring out Spyro's color palette and toying with a darker story, Spyro the Dragon was released in 1998 to positive reception critically and financially. On the surface, it might feel like a boring collectathon, but each level took advantage of the open-world design to add their own subtleties, making the task of collecting the gems and dragons challenging in its own way. It spawned 2 sequels, which were just as successful, but Insomniac decided to end it after Year of the Dragon. The reason being there was nothing new to do with him. As Ted Price says, he didn't have hands to hold something like a gun, which I'm sure explains what they did afterwards. Universal, not willing to just leave Spyro behind, hired a different game developer that was relatively new at the time, known as Check 6 Studios, to make the next game. And, well, Check 6 Studios had a lot of new ideas for where Enter the Dragonfly could go. As a matter of fact, they had 120 dragonflies to collect, and at least 25 levels. However, Universal forced them to Christmas rush it. Christmas rushing a game with an inexperienced team of developers. Boy, does that sure sound like a recipe for success. Yeah, Spyro Enter the Dragonfly flopped pretty hard, with critics citing the game's glitches, long load times, and a general incomplete nature as reasons for negative reviews. Of course, Ted Price joined in on the blunt attacks of Enter the Dragonfly, for while he was initially nice, after playing it, he ripped the game apart, going so far as to state how utterly in disbelief he was that some people assumed Insomniac made Enter the Dragonfly. Well, I don't know a stronger gut punch than being criticized by the president of the founding company of the series, and with that, you would have thought that Spyro died on that hill. But Enter the Dragonfly didn't put the final nail in the coffin for the Purple Dragon. No, that special honor goes to the Legend of Spyro trilogy. Okay, don't worry. This is not going to be me bashing the Legend of Spyro. At least, it's not meant to be. Looking back at my old reviews and playing these games now, they aren't quite the gems in the rough I used to think they were. It's hard to believe that a reboot that was a desperate attempt to save Spyro ended up inadvertently killing it for 10 years before the reignited trilogy revived it. A lot of people ask, was this trilogy necessary? And to be honest, I'm gonna have to say no, not really. It is true that Spyro is hurtling towards a dismal mess of mediocre to bad titles that were underperforming to the point perhaps a reboot was needed. That being said, to admit, while I never played Shadow Legacy, I hear that game ended on a cliffhanger. Yeah, maybe it was a victim to poor reception, but what they should have done was continue off that story while making a new game that improves off of Shadow Legacy. However, perhaps a better question would be, was The Legend of Spyro really worth the effort? Did it succeed in presenting a brand new take on Spyro that was mechanically innovative while boasting a deep storyline? Let me put it this way. These games do bring about a special kind of nostalgia for me, especially A New Beginning. However, as I forced myself to play these now, I couldn't help but wonder if this was a good idea for a video. If I could sum it all up, it would basically be like this. A New Beginning is boring, The Eternal Night is too frustrating, and Dawn of the Dragon improves over the predecessors, but still falls short in some ways. But before I sound like I'm being overtly negative towards these games, there are things that I like about them. First of all, compared to the originals, The Legend of Spyro is far more lore-rich, we actually get to see where Spyro comes from instead of being introduced to him out of the blue. Now, I do wish they went further with it. Like, they should have explained the meaning behind the Year of the Dragon, as well as how the eggs were born. But for the most part, it serves its purpose of creating the atmosphere for the Legend of Spyro, while also leaving room for speculation and theories. I enjoyed the whole questioning of the identity of Pyra, who is Ignitus' squire, that shows for one frame, as well as the speculation if Malefor had lied about there being other purple dragons between the time periods of him and Spyro, considering that Ignitus spoke only about there being 2 recorded throughout time. It kind of made The Legend of Spyro feel like it had a complex world surrounding the game instead of the simplicity the originals had. To add to this, I like what they're trying to do with Spyro. While in A New Beginning, Spyro comes across as stalwart and determined, the Eternal Knight goes a little deeper into his character growth. The game focuses on how far Spyro is willing to sacrifice for his friends, even to the point of trying to cheat fate. In the Eternal Knight, the Chronicler warns Spyro to remain inside of hiding. He's at his lowest point. The Night of Eternal Darkness is coming that will allow the Dark Master to set himself free from the Well of Souls. Worse, Cynder has been captured and will most likely be forced to join Malefor and his forces. Yet, despite the Chronicler telling Spyro he has no chance of standing up to Malefor and saving Cynder, he chooses to do it anyway, saying he needs to form his own path.
I know this is not the path you would choose for me, but I have to walk my own path and do what I know is right.
It kind of shows how Spyro wants to make his own distinctive direction instead of doing what his elders want. And what does he get? By trying to cheat fate, he ends up trapping Cynder, Sparx, and himself beneath the rubble of the Well of Souls while Malefor was liberated, which leaves Spyro in commission while Malefor is free to do whatever damage he wants to do. It's this tragic element that makes this version of Spyro an intriguing character. A Spyro who tries to go against the grain and choose the hard decision of putting his life on the line to protect his friends, even at the expense of failing to achieve a victory. However, I did say I like what they're trying to do with Spyro, meaning they kind of messed it up. As cathartic as it was to see Spyro attempt to pave his own way and ultimately fail in the end, Dawn of the Dragon only briefly touches this plot point. Wouldn't it have been interesting if Spyro contemplated how if he had decided differently, he would have been able to fight the Dark Master more effectively? It would have put more pressure on his shoulder to beat Malefor, considering his decision kind of let Malefor gain the upper hand after being freed. In fact, it could have made Cynder's declaration of love towards Spyro, "I love you," make more sense, because Spyro would have realized the feelings he has towards Cynder the more he struggles to reason with why he had chosen to disobey the Chronicler. Once he realizes it was because of his amity for Cynder, it will cause him to grow closer to her. I don't know, I'm just sort of making this up as I go. I understand that Spyro falling in love is controversial, but I feel that in the context of the entire trilogy, there was a way to make Cynder and Spyro falling in love have proper build-up instead of coming out of nowhere. Or how about Dark Spyro, which emerges after Spyro is hit by the beam of the Night of Eternal Darkness? It would have been cool if Spyro had to constantly wrestle with his dark side, almost like a yin-yang struggle. He literally was about to attack his friends when Cynder intervened. It would have been interesting if Cynder's presence kept Dark Spyro in check, in turn helping Spyro and Cynder form a stronger bond. I don't want it to sound like I'm shipping the two together, but it's just that the trilogy tends to focus so much on Cynder's dark side. Why not also put more emphasis on Spyro's? It would have been better than what we got in Dawn of the Dragon, which was just him turning into Dark Spyro for a mere matter of seconds after Ignitus' death. Explore this. Give Spyro a proper inner conflict that makes him question if he can truly beat Malefor. If he must constantly fight the darkness inside him, how can he beat the darkness that affects others? So clearly, Spyro had so many directions to take to make him a more interesting character, but they took the safe road, and Spyro just felt like a generic, coming-of-age hero that had so many unexplored arcs. And before you say this is supposed to be a kid's game, let's not forget how other kids' media, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, to which The Legend of Spyro takes a lot of inspiration from, put emphasis on a lot of dark themes. Never underestimate what children are capable of. Actually, I just realized while typing this that Dawn of the Dragon was made by a different developer, Etranges Libellulis, which explains some of the inconsistencies within the plot. I still sort of think I have a valid criticism, considering what's in the game is what's in the game, but it does make me wonder how things would have been different if Chrome Studios made Dawn of the Dragon. Of course, Elijah Woods' voice acting doesn't help the liven the generic undertones of this Spyro. Generally speaking, he really needs a cup of coffee, because my god, in some of these scenes he's not even trying. Often it feels like he's just reciting his lines. And Elijah, I know you can act. That being said, it might not be his fault, he could have just had bad voice direction. The last thing I'd like to talk about is Spyro's design. Everything looks fine except for his eyes. Sometimes they literally look like they're bursting out of their sockets. This was something I couldn't get past, even as a kid. I remember joking with my friend that even though they made Spyro to be all dark and edgy, his design ruined that serious tone, with my friend going so far as to say he looks like a purple frog. On the contrast, Sparx tries to be really funny, but his bad jokes ruined any humor he was trying to portray. Yup, we're going there. So here we start to go into the negative territory. Just like Spyro, he has a complete makeover. Not only is he sporting hands, but now he has a voice of his own. And honestly, even as a kid, I always felt like there wasn't anything essential that came out of that mouth of his. Nothing deep, 100% jokes. Basically, he's like Daxter, but really, really, really annoying. So much so that I'm not afraid to accuse him of ruining the tone of a lot of the series. And of course, he has had 3 different voice actors: David Spade, Billy West, and Wayne Bradley. Personally, I think Billy West is a little bit better than the other two, but for the most part, it just makes the character come across as even more awkward, like how this switch in voice actors was acknowledged in Dawn of the Dragon. I mean, I know that they've been in cryosleep within a crystal for so long, but the way Sparx brings this up and breaks the fourth wall just feels out of place for some reason.
It's good to see you too. You okay?
You know, a little stiff. Voice keeps changing, but I'm good.
Shut the f*** up!
I know they're trying to go for a brotherly bond with Spyro here, but for the most part their interactions feel forced. Because all of Sparx's lines are jokes, he either feels like background noise, or you get this sense that Spyro is begrudgingly taking him along. I'd probably argue about 80% of the time the characters don't even bat an eye to Sparx, because a lot of the things he says are just so out of the blue that writing a proper response to his jokes would send a script off the rails. The Legend of Spyro also introduces some new characters, such as Cynder and Ignitus. Now, I actually really like Cynder. Unlike Spyro, she actually has an internal conflict dealing with the fact she at one point was the destructive evil dragon serving the Dark Master. Despite the fact Spyro saves her in the end, she can't let go of her past. This struggle makes her far more interesting than Spyro, who felt like your everyday hero from your typical fantasy novel. But they could have taken steps to show how this affected her instead of telling it. Maybe make the Guardians untrusting towards her. They could place some kind of special surveillance on her in fear of what she once was. As for Spyro, instead of automatically believing that Cynder was no longer Malefor's servant, what if he too was suspicious? The only one who articulates mistrust is Sparx, but if Spyro also felt like he couldn't come to terms with her, then that would make for some interesting character development with how he comes around to her and accepts she's not what she used to be. I mean, she spent a good amount of the first game trying to kill him, so I'm not sure how forgiving he'd be. The actual games are so one-sided in the sense that Cynder is the one constantly getting reminded of what she once was, and Spyro is the only one who forgives and forgets. Even on Spyro's side, there would have to be some sort of resentment. And before you say, well, Cynder obviously turned back into her normal form at the end of A New Beginning, how could she pose a threat? Well, there's a twist towards the end of Dawn of the Dragon. Malefor reveals that Cynder used Spyro to set himself free.
me what?
How she lured you to dwell of souls. How she slipped you in the free.
You're lying.
I find it peculiar how you've chosen to learn things. Make it sure it was you who freed Spyro, and you who brought me back.
Honestly, in the context of the original story, this makes no sense. However, if you change Spyro's character a little and have him struggle to trust her, then it fits much better, because Malefor would be toying with the trauma Spyro felt about his past experiences with Cynder when she was under the Dark Master's control. The fact Spyro responds by refusing to fight back would be more impactful because he would have gone from not trusting her to putting aside the past and learning to forgive her. I'm not saying I don't like Cynder's arc, it just needed more refinement because it really didn't have that depth it should have had. They could have explored themes about PTSD with Cynder, but instead we just got pirate ship and fighting monsters. Not that those things are bad, it's a kid's adventure game after all, but never underestimate what children are capable of. You know what I'm saying? You know? The other character worth mentioning is Ignitus. He serves as the mentor figure for Spyro and a master of fire. There's not much else to say about him, because his role gradually diminishes with each game. In The New Beginning, he spends a lot of time teaching Spyro the ropes. In The Eternal Night, he's a non-entity, and in Dawn of the Dragon, he appears in a couple of scenes before dying. A lot of his personality comes from Gary Oldman's acting. He adds a bit of a rasp undertone to his low-pitched voice in order to convey someone ancient and wise in their years, but also simmering underneath with a painful past and anger that can surge in a moment. I also think they did a good job at creating a hierarchy of dragons through the Guardians. Each of them are a master of a certain element, as well as a personality trait that goes along with it. Since Voltaire is master of electricity, his trait is to talk really fast and be eccentric. Since Cyril is master of ice, his main trait is to give the cold shoulder through his pompousness and arrogance. These might be like one-note stereotypes, but they're more meaningful than the general characteristics of the elders in the originals. They also add more to the lore. Whereas with the originals, it was vague with what role they played in the game world, The Legend of Spyro has the Guardians be responsible for protecting the worlds. They fight wars against the Dark Armies and tragically lose. This kind of backstory was missing in the originals. I just wish the Guardians' involvement wasn't so diminished in the subsequent Legend of Spyro games. At the end of the day, in the character and story department, The Legend of Spyro sadly falls flat. And that's too bad, because it had a lot going for it. The lore-rich story gave the world some creative outlets. Too bad the narrative itself chooses the more generic path. Making Spyro a dragon born every 10 generations to fulfill a prophecy is cool, but his character ends up being your typical coming-of-age hero with all the different arcs he could have taken ignored. Seriously, it's frustrating. They had everything to make a more mature Spyro, but when you choose the safe side of making a bare-bones plot without any subtleties, when you have a Sparx cracking jokes non-stop that interferes with a darker tone, when you have plot points get reduced to too much telling over showing, you can only wonder where the cigar went. Granted, they were under a tight budget, so maybe I shouldn't be too hard on them, but what we got is what we got, and I have no choice but to judge it based on that. And the gameplay isn't exempt from this. As much as I hate to say it, it suffers much worse than the story. Generally speaking, all three of them are beat-em-up titles. If I were to be more positive, each of the games have little quirks that makes the otherwise monotonous task of beating enemies a bit more fun. In A New Beginning, the electricity breath tosses enemies around. It's very enjoyable seeing them bounce back and forth and throwing them off cliffs. If you're stuck in an annoying section, like that one part in Dante's Freezer, where you have to fight all those Dreadwings, you can just throw them over the edge, instead of fighting all of them. For the Eternal Night, the Earth-based breath, or ball if you'd call it, was really effective against enemies considering you could expand and contract it to make these apes your persistent punching bag. It helps that the sound effects are satisfying too. Dawn of the Dragon plays like a completely different game, and fixes some of the problems the predecessors had, which I'll detail later, but for A New Beginning and The Eternal Night, I mostly only referred to one attack that made it a game fun, and that's because these games suffer from none other than dominant strats. This especially affects A New Beginning, and a lot of this has to do with the level designs. Now, I love the levels of A New Beginning. They give a great sense of atmosphere, like how Dante's Freezer reminds me of an abandoned war fortress that shows hints of a civilization that was once among the living, or how Munitions Forge makes me think of an outdoors factory with mine carts and machines bustling about. But as much as I love the general design and feel of them, they were so damn long. Or maybe they feel long considering you'll be doing the exact same thing for every level, which involves nothing but fighting waves and waves of enemies. Electricity is probably the best way to deal with this because it barely takes any effort to take them out, allowing you to breeze through some of the more atrocious forced fights, although I will concede that Earth is just as good when upgraded. And a lot of it has to do with how boring the base combat is. Your melee abilities never get expanded upon. Sure, your breath can be upgraded, but your melee combat remains fixed. Ignitus teaches a couple moves in his training section, but you don't learn any new combos beyond that, so you're stuck doing the same ground and air combos over and over, and it gets old fast. Once in a while, the level will have a platforming section or puzzle to solve, like using snowballs to take out a turret, or navigating a ball into a holder, but these are a rarity compared to the 90% of the stage taken over by combat. And it's the same story for boss fights. No matter what different scenario the fight may bring, pelting them with firebombs always seems to be the best method. My point is that A New Beginning's core gameplay is so bland, so bare bones, that the path of most convenience is the one you'll end up going by. Granted, the game does sort of break away from this formula with a couple differing gameplay styles, but these features feel so unnecessary they actually weigh the game down. One of these new features are the flying sections. Overall, they implemented it very poorly considering they are plain rail shooters. Granted, these parts do provide some nice scenery. You really get to see how big the Legend of Spyro world really is with the views of the landscape. For instance, in the first flying level, there are a lot of islands scattered about, representing sections of tall plains, and the slow descent towards Dante's Freezer makes it feel like I'm entering an evil lair. Combine that with the title screen music playing in the background, and you can almost feel the majesty of soaring in the air for the first time. Too bad all you do is fly straight and shoot fireballs while cannons spew easy-to-dodge monkeys. The breath abilities also have training dojo sessions where you get to learn how to utilize one of the elements. I mean, what's there to say? They're just in the way and interrupt the pacing. Instead of letting you mess around and experiment, they make you take a class on how to use them. How nice. And I use games to escape my structured, workaholic life filled with stupid overtime, not endure a worse version of it. As you can see, I'm clearly a big fan of the first entry, but would I say that the Eternal Night pulls the purple dragon out of the rubble? Well, the gameplay still suffers from a great deal of repetition. However, it does improve over a couple aspects. First of all, the elemental breaths are now used to solve environmental puzzles, like how you need to cool a fire with ice breath, or using fire to activate these little ball things into celestial caves. The game also has more of an emphasis on platforming and collectibles, so it's not all bashing enemies with your head. However, I wish there was more to them than just increasing health and mana. At the same time, there are also areas where this game falls apart, and, you guessed it, that damned difficulty comes to mind. There are enemies that hit Spyro so hard that he gets stuck in a stunned animation, which leaves him open to getting pummeled if in a group of foes. Some enemies will hit you out of a combo, and not to mention that their attacks deliver much more damage than before, so at the end of the day, it's a lot more difficult than the first game, and if you top it off with the terribly long, padded levels, Looking at you, pirate ship. Then you have a recipe for an experience that feels worse even with the improvements. I don't know what it was, but with the Eternal Night, I felt like I had to force myself to sit and play. And the thing that really had me kicking and screaming were those rail shooter minigames. What's so frustrating about them? Well, strafing feels really stiff, so it's hard to dodge the Dreadwings' fireballs. The fireballs have these weird hitboxes, so even though I could have sworn I evaded, it still hits sometimes. And whenever he does hit you, he flies away, which makes it harder to land a strike with one of your own firebombs. To add to icing on the cake of frustration, it was really hard to figure out how much I needed to charge my firebombs in order for it to land on the Dreadwing. So half the time I ended up missing. Of course, maybe you can rely on Dragon Time to help with the dodging, and that does help quite a bit, except that it drains fairly quickly. It's supposed to help you with some precision-based platforming and a couple of bosses. It's useful in its own way, but it also messes with the pacing of the level. I mean, some of the platforming sections require you to slow down time between each jump, which kind of makes the whole experience feel pretty sluggish to go through, especially when you have to wait for the meter to recharge in the middle of each leap. So the Eternal Night is frustrating, not only in the "oh my god, I'll break my controller" kind of way, but also in the fact that there were so many good things going for it, yet it still discombobulates. Partly because it makes some new issues to go along with some of the old, reoccurring problems of A New Beginning. However, Dawn of the Dragon manages to recover, at least to a certain extent. Unlike the repetitive beat-em-up by Chrome Studios, Étranges Libelules at least varies things up a little bit. Spyro now has a weak and strong attack, and can chain these together to unleash devastating blows on enemies. You also have the option to play as Cynder, who has her own arsenal of elements like poison, fear, wind, and shadow. In this playthrough, I tried playing as Cynder, and I don't know how unpopular this is, I found her poison ability to be useful, especially the tail whip she does. I don't know, it was just an interesting find, especially considering that most people seem to think wind is the most powerful. Anyway, so yeah, it's a God of War clone. However, while this is a lot better than the predecessors, your melee combos still tend to be fixed, so a lot of the growth is still limited to the breaths like the previous two games. So in that sense, gameplay repetition is still present, but it isn't as bad. Another mechanic worth mentioning is flight. And no, this isn't the crappy rail shooter from A New Beginning. Dawn of the Dragon allows you to be more free in exploring unknown crevices. It's very satisfying to find a hidden gem shard way up top in Avalar and wonder, God, how do I get up there? Unfortunately, Avalar is the only level that is like this because the other stages are more centered around the war. Although I will say that some parts in the game take advantage of the flight ability through the sheer sense of scale it brings. The end of the Catacombs is one such example. Flying into Avalar presents such a view that I can feel the freedom of Spyro and Cynder. After being trapped in Crystal for 3 years, this part feels earned for our main protagonists. Or the level where you climb the body of the Destroyer to eliminate the Dark Crystals, and then later go into his mouth and exterminate what's left. In this sense, they really used the flying feature to create levels of great magnitude that have you doing impossible feats that involve more than collecting gems. The final thing I'd mention is this game's co-op feature. It's pretty clear Étranges designed this game to be played with 2 players. One area will have Spyro spin in a circle to light 4 torches perpendicular to one another, while Cynder hangs on in the center to create a centripetal force effect. Furthermore, whenever there are switches, both Spyro and Cynder have to press down on them. Overall, Dawn of the Dragon is best enjoyed with someone else, but if a friend isn't available, it's easy to switch back and forth between Spyro and Cynder to solve puzzles. It might sound like a small thing, but the fact the single-player experience is just as good as the 2-player, despite the game being designed for the latter, isn't something I can say for all co-op games. As a side note, I find it really cute how they tried to integrate a snake thing that ties Spyro and Cynder together into the story as some kind of substance made from Malefor's magic. However, it ends up going nowhere and is never brought up again until the end. You can tell that Etrandris really wanted to do something with it story-wise, but wasn't able to do so, most likely because of low budget. But we'll never know for sure how this would have played out if it had been given a more important role. I don't know, just something I felt like mentioning. I could just end it here, but in order to make the nail-biting, head-banging process of writing this script worth it, I've decided to finish this off with how I'd write The Legend of Spyro. At least now I can say I cramped my hands for something. So I never quite understood why Spyro cared so much for Cynder. If anything, it felt kind of forced. Being born in the same brood of eggs means nothing because they're not even born yet. When Spyro says he saw something familiar in Cynder,
There was something in her eyes, Ignitus. Something familiar.
what is he talking about? When you're in an egg, you can't see anything. So I propose making a new beginning begin with Spyro and Cynder already being born. In fact, all the eggs from the Year of the Dragon are already hatched, and there should be an explanation for how the Year of the Dragon works. Every generation, a dragon couple will give birth to an egg, and they transport it to the temple where the 4 guardians are meant to look after it. Every 10 generations, an egg holding a purple dragon falls within the brood, and at this point in time, Spyro's egg had arrived, as well as Cynder's. After they hatch, the 2 of them will spend time together and become mutual friends while watched over by the guardians. All seems well until tragedy strikes. The apes raid the Dragon Temple, but Ignitus, in the nick of time, manages to snatch Spyro and fly him to safety. As for the other babies, they're all taken to a bunker while the Dragon Guardians are ordered to protect them. Ignitus lays Spyro on a mushroom pad, and, while baby Spyro cries, asks the ancestors to look after him.
May the ancestors look after you. May they look after us all.
From here, the events of A New Beginning play out as normal. The only difference is that Spyro is already born when Sparx's parents find him. Therefore, he knows he's not a dragonfly and has PTSD of past events. I know the movie script draft has something like he attends dragonfly school, but I'd go the Harry Potter route and maybe have him struggle to adapt to a new family. Maybe not have the dragonflies be quite like the Dursleys, but he'll never feel like he's fully integrated with them. His only friend to comfort him in his alienation would be Sparx. As he spends more time with Sparx and becomes a surrogate brother to him, Spyro gradually starts to fit in despite his dragon features. However, after seeing his friend almost get killed by the apes, he realizes his presence may not be good for the family and leaves. He's haunted by the memories of the temple attack and can't bear to put the dragonflies in harm's way. He initially goes alone, but later gets joined by Sparx. But instead of being comic relief like he is in the original game, Sparx has all the bad jokes omitted from his personality so he could actually serve the role as an actual true companion for Spyro, like Sam from Lord of the Rings. I guess they were going for this anyway, but without the bad humor, he'd be even better. So Spyro runs into Ignitus, and this time, because he experienced him when he was younger, he remembers him. However, something has changed about Ignitus. The Crimson, powerful Fire Guardian looks older and weakened. He details Spyro on the events that happened between him leaving and to now. So in this version, Cynder still does get corrupted. However, maybe Ignitus doesn't recognize her when he engages her on the battlefield. Therefore, she's simply referred to as the Black Dragon, considering Ignitus can't be sure if she truly is Cynder. Spyro, enraged at the news, feels a newfound determination to retake his old home. So, the rest of A New Beginning kind of remains the same. Spyro goes out of his way to rescue all the Guardians and save the realms. He learns the different breaths, considering he's the special purple dragon that can master all the elements. Ignitus gets kidnapped, and you know the drill. My take only changes when Spyro fights Cynder for the very first time, and he sees something familiar in her eyes. It was then that he has a flashback of a memory of Cynder. training with her, playing with her when they were little, and he connects the dots. Ignitus tries to comfort him, but dissuades Spyro from going after her. But Spyro shows a newfound determination to not just stop Cynder from freeing the Dark Master from Convexity, but also potentially save his old friend. He travels to Convexity, fights Cynder, and uses the Aether Breath to finish her off. Seeing her transform back into the young dragoness Spyro remembered her being brought a sense of catharsis to his terrible memories, almost as if he felt comforted that he could have a fraction of his past back. Well, a couple years pass, and not everything has been going smoothly for Cynder back at the Dragon Temple. While initially the Guardians took her again graciously, slowly their suspicions began to arise again. Even Spyro himself, while initially feeling a sense of relief for saving Cynder, can't help but feel questionable after a while. Terrador himself was ordered to keep a close eye, while Cyril and Voltaire whispered amongst themselves whether the she-dragon could truly be trusted. Bothered by all this, Cynder decides to leave the Dragon Temple. Sparx informs Spyro about this, and after a brief hesitation, he chooses to talk to her. However, the conversation is different because Spyro is still trying to come to terms with what Cynder had done as the monster she once was. At the same time, he remembers all the years of growing up together while younger, and there's a part of him that wants to consider her as a friend. She relays to Spyro how guilty she is of her past actions. Look, Cynder, to be honest, I have trouble fully forgiving you, but I do my best to get over it. Besides, it's not safe out there, Spyro replies, to which Cynder becomes even more insecure and runs off, causing Spyro to feel guilty of his poor choice of words until he faints and has the vision of the Chronicler's voice. So instead of the Chronicler telling Spyro to seek some tree, which was a point that goes nowhere, he instead tells Spyro to go and seek out Cynder without telling him why. The temple gets attacked as before. Spyro talks about his dream of the Chronicler and how he was told to go after Cynder. Now, I think the Chronicler needs some kind of backstory that he was this maverick guardian of time, and his unorthodox abilities of seeing into one's past and future caused him to know too much of the other guardians. Therefore, he was exiled. Ignitus warns of the vagueness behind the Chronicler's message, and the thing he worried about the most was Spyro turning into Cynder. But Spyro felt like he was being pulled. While the Guardians try to barricade Spyro from leaving the temple, he sneaks out with Sparx. Now, if there's one thing to change about this next part, make the damn pirate ship section applicable to the plot! This section was so long and drawn out, and felt the least necessary. In order for this to be better integrated into the story, have the pirates be related to the apes. Their main goal in capturing both Cynder and Spyro was to transfer them to the Will of Souls to be slaves for Gaul until Malefor returns. The Felmutharina sequence plays out the exact same way. The pirate apes pit Spyro and Cynder against each other mainly for the fun of it. The only difference is that unlike in the original game, this time they actually fight each other, and Cynder ends up using her dark abilities. This deters Spyro, and suddenly he no longer sees his innocent friend he saved. Now he could only see the fearsome black dragon he defeated long ago. I'd say this would probably be similar to the illusion scene when Wonder Woman was fighting Superman and she never realized it was him. In this case, Spyro's PTSD would kick in and he'd aggressively attack Cynder until he realized how hard he's been fighting. However, before he could process what he's done, heavy storms strike the hulls of the ship. Spyro, too shocked from the past event, ends up jumping away in horror as soon as he sees a Dreadwing carry Cynder's unconscious body away. Spyro fights his way off the ship, and then, mid-flight, he ends up passing out. Within the dream world of the Chronicler, Spyro demands answers. And I mean, he literally screams in frustration towards the Chronicler. "What's the point?" he cries out. "I ended up fighting her as soon as I found her. I just can't fully forgive her for what she's done in the past. It's here that the chronicler shows Cynder in captivity and what Gaul plans to do with her if Spyro were to give up. With that, Spyro presses on. As he washes up on the shore of the Celestial Caves, he talks to Sparx. Sparx, I'm not sure if I can do this. Like, is this even worth it? What if I can't do it? Sparx lets out a coy grin. Did I turn my back on you after you left the swamp? Did you simply decide to just out-and-out quit when the apes took over the temple? He asked. We've come too far to turn back now. Spyro smiled. I knew I brought you for a reason, he thought. So the whole Celestial Caves plays out the exact same way, as well as Spyro's meeting with the Chronicler. The only thing I'd change is that the Chronicler warned Spyro to only rescue Cynder and to not engage with Malefor if the Night of Eternal Darkness occurs, for he has no chance of undoing the prophecy of his release from the Well of Souls. Spyro, being the stubborn young dragon he is, declares that he's going to save Cynder and stop Malefor, saying that this doesn't have to be set in stone. So Spyro makes it to the Mountain of Malefor. He encounters Gaul and Cynder, in which the latter is knocked unconscious, leaving Gaul to fight Spyro. Now the Night of Eternal Darkness occurs, and in the middle of the fight, Malefor is set free. He participates in the battle by backing Gaul up, who was already badly beaten by Spyro. Spyro engages and fights Malefor and Gaul, but Malefor had other tactics instead of charging head-on.
As you can see, Dragon, you are alone. There's nothing you can do. Look at Cynder. Look at her unconscious form. You can do nothing to save her.
He taunts. In anger, Spyro gives in to his inner darkness and becomes Dark Spyro. He kills Gaul in a final fury, and it nearly turns on his friends until Cynder stops him. Malefor laughs as he brings down the place upon the trio. Spyro has no choice but to preserve himself in crystal, awaiting the right time to face Malefor and atone for his mistake. 3 years pass, and the events of Dawn of the Dragon occur. For the most part, everything stays the same except the general absence of Spyro is felt as Malefor wages war. The original game touched on this briefly in a scene where Spyro contemplates how he failed everyone, but I'd like the whole story to focus on Spyro overcoming the remorse he feels of not being there when Malefor attacked. When Spyro escapes the catacombs and other residents like the cheetahs see him, they're overjoyed. After all, the news of him being able to defeat Cynder and save the realms has spread, so he's famous for being a hero. When Spyro returns after a long time, they believe the Purple Dragon can change the tide of war. However, after Spyro returned from his dormant state in the catacombs, he wasn't the same, for the essence of Dark Spyro remained inside him. The purity that had once characterized Spyro now tainted by the darkness he received while fighting Malefor. Therefore, he feels the need to hide this from all people he interacts with, whether that be the cheetahs, Hunter, or especially the Guardians, in fear of facing the same discrimination Cynder received for being the Black Dragon. This has an effect gameplay-wise, because instead of Cynder having her own shadow abilities, now Spyro alternates between his regular abilities of fire, ice, earth, and electricity, while receiving some new dark powers like wind, poison, shadow, and fear. In this case, Spyro will constantly feel pressured to present himself in such a way that people expect. A hero ready to do his duty. However, within himself, he'll be having a conflict with his dark half, as from time to time, he'll turn into Dark Spyro as a response of dealing with his anxiety of saving the world from Malefor. However, as overbearing as this conflict is, he'll grow closer to Cynder, who already knows what it's like to harbor a monster inside. The once tattered relationship will mend as they spend time together taking out Malefor's forces, such as the Destroyer. However, Malefor had one last card to play. He tried to manipulate Spyro, telling him the truth about Cynder that he had speculated all this time, that Cynder was the one who led Spyro to set him free, that Malefor himself had been working inside Cynder. Malefor temporarily turns Cynder back into the Black Dragon, who attacks Spyro. He again tries to tell Spyro he is all alone. However, unlike last time, Spyro doesn't give in to his inner darkness. He resists fighting back against Cynder, which changes her back. Once again, Spyro had saved her from the Dark Master's grip. And I'd say the rest of the events of Dawn of the Dragon play out the same. Malefor, Spyro, and Cynder fight, they win, and Spyro prevents the world from breaking apart. Maybe I'd leave out Cynder falling in love with Spyro, so that's at least some improvement. Obviously, I'm no expert in the Legend of Spyro lore, and it might even feel rushed because I'm sitting here in a break room at work, frantically putting down words on a sheet of paper. But hopefully it fixes some stuff. Before closing, I'll say that I do respect the Legend of Spyro for what it's trying to do. Considering that the Spyro franchise was practically dead at that point, it really was a leap of faith to reboot the series with revamped gameplay and a darker tone. And, of course, I played A New Beginning more times than I can count. However, looking at them now, they really fall short, and I can tell why this was the trilogy that killed Spyro for 10 years before coming back as a remake of the originals. It's kind of ironic how he was killed in the riskiest way possible and saved in the safest way possible. Well, here's hoping Spyro 4 is good. As always, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.